You're listening to 94.4 FM Salford City Radio, the Friday Sports Show.
You're listening to Salford City Radio, 94.4 FM, the Friday Sports Show. For your host, Jimmy Petruzzi, bringing you news from the local area and around the world. We bring Salford to the world and the world to Salford. We've been very fortunate in the show to have interviewed guests, some of the world's best sports people, athletes, coaches, sports psychologists, people who work in sport across a wide range of disciplines. We've gone around the world with our International Perspectives show. We sort of speak to people all around the world to get an insight into what goes on around the world in sports. The aim of our show is to increase awareness, participation in sport, and we also have a segment that we speak to some of the world's most influential people in the field of psychology and related fields. Today we go across to the other side of the world again, and we're going to speak to an interesting guest who works in rugby. And we've got many rugby fans that listen to the show, so I'm sure you'll find this really interesting. He's well travelled and worked in a lot of places around the world, and he's back now. Well, he's in Australia, been in Australia, and his main role at the moment is assistant coach at Newcastle Wildfire Rugby Club. It's John Muggleton. Welcome to the show. Great to have you on board.
Thank you, Jim. It's a pleasure. Got great memories of my time as a player in England and coaching over there as well. So, very happy to talk to you.
Thanks, John. So, for yourself, John, how did it sort of begin for you? How did you sort of get into rugby? What was your inspiration to go into rugby as a player and then transition as a coach? Well,
I've got another brother, so basically whatever he did, I wanted to do. He was playing in the under nines, which was the lowest age group you could play in those days. We're talking mid 60s. So I used to get training and kick the football around, and somehow ended up at 5 years old being in the 9Bs.
Wow.
Because that's where it started for me, and I just lapped it up. I enjoyed all parts of it, from the physical effort to the competition, and also skill side of it and the camaraderie. So, it's been a major part of my life and something that I like.
Brilliant. And so, I mean, in terms of your sort of playing career, John, what would you say some of the highlights for you were as a player?
I got to represent our country. I played for the Kangaroos here in Australia, and was fortunate enough to be selected on the 82 Kangaroo Tour, which is known over there as the Invincibles. We went through undefeated, so that whole 3 months of working together, and the pressure that built with that undefeated was immense. I got to play at Wembley in the 85 final against and John Ferguson and Peter Stelling was on my team. Which is a great highlight. 97 people. It's just blows your mind to think about it. And at Parramatta we were good enough to win 4 premierships, of which I played in 3 of them here. So I was very, very lucky to find myself in some very good teams and have my skill just complement those guys around us.
Brilliant. And at what point for you, John, did you you mentioned there, like at 5-year-old, you found yourself playing, a few age groups up, and at what point did you realise that you thought, well, I've got something here, I can sort of play at the highest level? Was it sort of an age where you thought, well, I can do this type thing?
It's very difficult to say when. It was probably not until my late teens when I transferred full time from rugby union to rugby league that I was picked in Jersey Flegg, which is an under 17s competition here, but they changed the age. So I played 3 years in it. So I played as a 16-year-old in the 17s, and then they put it up, so 17, 18, and was selected in New South Wales versus Queensland under 18s representative team. So it was honestly as late as that where I thought that I could,
Wow.
play first grade and go through, because it's very tough in Sydney. There were 12 Sydney teams in those days, and there are a lot of good players for some reason that go through. So you really got to keep your foot on the pedal and your head about you. And I was lucky enough to have the support of coaches and family that kept my feet on the ground.
Yeah, and absolutely. And for yourself, John, I mean, we sort of see these days players sort of transition from different codes and rugby and league and union. And I mean, I suppose you could say you were one of the first sort of. I mean, so not the first person, but obviously, at that point, it was a lot different to now. What was it like for you in terms of, you got rugby union, league? What were the differences for you in terms of the different games?
They were completely different in those days, and exclusive. If you're a rugby union player and you to rugby league and became a professional, you just didn't go back. You weren't let back. Later on, you could buy. Ironically, you could buy your amateur status back, but no. In fact, my brother and I, living in the same house, he was 21 and I was a professional footballer at 18. He could have, in the rules of rugby, been kicked out of his rugby union club, Parramatta Rugby Union, just because he was living in the same premises as a professional.
Wow. That puts it into context, really, in terms of, and so, I mean, in terms of just for our listeners in the game itself, I mean, I suppose for the general layperson watching, obviously, I'm sure they're aware, but what in terms of playing the game, what would you say sort of physically? I know the game has changed a lot now over the years, and rugby union is sort of professional now, but what would you say the main things were playing union and league, John? What are the main sort of differences in terms of in terms of adapting and sort of is it physical? Is it the mental side of the game? Is it the rules and?
I think it's just the continuous nature of rugby union. The possession is guaranteed. That's really important. Although in our day, rugby league wise, you could strike for the ball play the ball and win it there. But in general terms, in rugby league, you had it for 6 tackles. You could be more structured. Yeah. Where rugby, you lose the ball at any occasion, and then instead of a knock on, you could be facing a full on onslaught of the transition from defence to back, which has become such a highlight in the game.
Mm-hmm. Now, interesting. In terms of the coaching, John, for you, I mean, we've seen sort of coaches cross codes, and we've seen sort of coaches in rugby league go across the union and make an impact. Whether be sort of defensive coaches or in other areas. But what would you say for yourself to sort of when you went into sort of coaching for you? What was the transition like? You're a player, you've played at the highest level, then you find yourself as a coach, and how did you find you made the transition to coaching?
Well, I was a trained PE teacher and was working as a PE teacher while I was playing. So that part of it was I enjoyed teaching skill, and I did mentor quite a few of the young blokes I was playing. When I was in reserve grade and reserve grade captain, I was helping the younger blokes with their skills. So I really enjoyed the satisfaction of them improve. So it sort of became a natural progression, and my first job as a coach basically was as captain coach, which in country rugby league here, it's quite common, and it used to be very common for ex-players to go to the country and actually keep playing in the country and coach at the same time. So you're an on-field coach. That was a natural transition for me, and I enjoyed it. We had some success, although we didn't win the grand final. We made a grand final in the 2 years up there. it just piqued my interest to do it full time.
Mm-hmm. And that would sort of lead to opportunities for you to coach outside of Australia, abroad. And what was your experience like, coaching in different places, John? How was that like to sort of go out there, and I suppose from a standard perspective too, like the levels of sort of ability of the players, and just generally, what were the differences sort of coaching abroad?
Yeah, a lot of difference. But players are different in different countries. Have a different feeling about the history of the game. Particularly the Welsh. It's such a big part of national their rugby, and of course Georgians when I was there, how that fitted in. It's basically the national sport there, along with Greek Roman.
Right.
So, look of it as well. But I think the one thing I learned very early is that you coach what's in front of you. So you have to adapt your coaching more to the player, challenge them, and you really, look at how they learn, and people are different. And I found that experience in Georgia with an interpreter was very beneficial when I went to Japan for 3 years, and how I prepared myself to go over there, what the phrases, etc. that I taught myself Japanese, so that I could do some of the communication, some of the instant coaching without an interpreter needing to explain everything that I said.
Mm-hmm. And it's interesting. In terms of sort of the level in Japan, John, what was that like at that point? I mean, obviously we see now that it's sort of improved, and they're certainly competitive at sort of national level. But what would you say? What was like when you were out there? The actual level itself.
Look, the amount of good players that they brought in the time that I was there. Dan Carter was playing for Kobe Steel. A very, very well drilled team, and I think more and more good coaches been taken over. A couple of the Kiwis, a couple of South Africans. They went from the playing side of it, just getting as many good players as they could get, to working with organisations like the Crusaders and making partnerships, which meant that they got feedback, they got programs, and they got coaches who could really tap into the player and get as much out of them as they could. Japanese are wonderful to coach. They are. They have a real love of their team because it's a company-based team, owned by their company, and when you join a company, and basically, particularly like Toyota, where I was, you're there for life.
Wow.
So it's very, they're very, very dedicated, and they're getting more and more talented. They come through the university where there's over 140, team, playing rugby over there. So it's a very wide support.
No, definitely. I mean, so it wouldn't have been a surprise to you in terms of when we sort of. I mean, I suppose it was at that World Cup where I think they beat South Africa. If my memory serves me correctly, kind of send the shockwave around the world, really. But I mean, obviously, I can imagine it's in a one-off. But they proved to be consistent, John. So for yourself, did you there was no surprise for you to sort of see him progress and see him as competitive they are in world rugby now, or?
No, they still have a few key positions filled with foreigners, and their muscle and their leadership comes from foreigners. But in general term, the influence they've got blokes, international coaches like Wayne Smith, who coached the All Blacks for years, Robbie Deans, who was coached the Crusaders and was Australian national coach, Jake White. And now, the influence of those people is immense experience at the club level, so when they go to the national level, they're all ready to having the input that they need to be better players, and it's an easier transition to the standard of a team with the foreign coaches. They've got a Kiwi coach in Jamie Joseph, so not surprised by it anymore, but it's more a transition to the national team, but standards and that are much better in underlying competitions.
Yeah, absolutely. And with yourself, John, I know you're sort of involved with your first team, but do you or have you been involved in sort of development, sort of youth development as well, or is this mainly your role throughout your career as a coach has been at sort of senior level?
Well, look, wherever I've been, I've made myself available to clubs, whether it be in Wales, where I went down to Tenby and guest coached down there, and
wow.
Or to do coaching courses and lecturer coaching courses. I've always made myself available because I think it's important as a coach that you don't get stuck in that.
Yeah.
That you don't get stuck that I'm the first team coach, or I'm here with the higher level. I can't be bothered, or I can't put in other, because if you want the club to succeed and the club employs you, that you've got to delve at some degree and at some level in the player pathway coming towards you, because you don't know how long you're going to be there.
Yeah.
It's a funny game, coaching. So it's for your own benefit and for the club's benefit. After all, the club pays your wages, and you just get a good wedge for what you do. Yeah. So you should work hard for your money, I think.
Absolutely. And I mean, you mentioned there sort of as a coach, you don't know how long you're going to be obviously at a club, and things can change pretty quickly. What's it like working, I mean, just for the, people genuinely listening in, you sort of, obviously you've worked around the different parts of the world, and does that ever play, do you think, in the coach's mind, John, in terms of saying, okay, well, we're 2 or 3 defeats on the spin, to the pressure's on, and just sort of carry on doing what you know to the best of your ability? What, in terms of as a coach, what's it like working under those, with the reality that in sport, in any code really, it's a results orientated business that the pressure's on?
Yeah, look, it's more so for head coaches, and high-profile coaches who get a lot of money to do it. They're the ones who are under pressure, and it tends more to be league than rugby union, unless you go to France, which I've been never to coach at, where that sort of things happens, and it depends on the quality of the management and the understanding of the game and the management as well. So I've never been in that situation where I thought, if we lose this game this weekend, we're all going to get sacked. So I suppose I've been lucky, but I'm also a little bit careful about who I coach for, because you can damage, by making a bad choice, you can damage your reputation, and you can damage your livelihood if you're careful.
Yes, a really good point, John. I'm sure there's a lot of young coaches listening to that, thinking about different opportunities that present themselves, and sort of, obviously we're all on our own journey, but sort of, thinking through things carefully. I suppose it comes down to expectation too as well, I would think, in terms of what the team, what their expectations are, and what resources they have to achieve. I mean, for example, in football, John, we see teams, soccer, football, sometimes they might not have realistic expectations in terms of the resources they've got and where they want to finish in the table in some respects. And do you find that sort of in rugby things have changed over the years, with the game sort of moving more towards, well, obviously a lot of professional teams out there? Do you find that sort of crept into rugby a little bit in terms of what teams want and obviously resources they've got to achieve that?
Yeah, definitely. That you've got to have the cattle. Good players make good coaches. So you've got to be understanding that you can you can get to a situation where you're coaching a whole lot of players that you wouldn't, if you had your choice, you wouldn't buy them. You wouldn't use. They're not players that you like. That's so you've got to be careful. On that basis, have a look at the playing staff, and you're also got, as an assistant coach, you really got trust in the recruitment and the head coach that they've got enough sense and enough ability to put a squad together that's going to give you an opportunity of being successful.
No, brilliant. That's interesting point there in terms of, particularly for any sort of coaches of any age, but particularly young coaches, sometimes certain opportunities might present themselves, and just thinking things through and sort of going forward. And as a coach, John, you're sort of, as you mentioned as a player, some of the highlights, but as a sort of coach, I'm sure that you could probably do a whole Netflix series on your highlights. To be fair, you've been different places, and I'm sure you experienced a lot of things. But just generally, what would you say some of the things that stick to mind for you as a coach? Some of the highlights have been for you.
Look, I was lucky enough, not lucky enough because I worked pretty hard during those times. But the time that I was at Wallabies and we introduced the more structured defence and actual roles and responsibility. The defenders in set piece defence. We won 5 Bledisloe Cups in a row. We won 2 Tri-Nation. We won a World Cup and came second in the World Cup, and we beat the British and Irish Lions for the first time. So just that time at the Wallabies, and I was lucky enough to have 2 coaches who both had trust in me and both allowed me, one with a little bit more supervision than the other one, but they kept their finger on what I did, but they trusted that when I told them, I need to do this and I need to do that, that's what needed done. So, Rod McQueen was tremendous. He was the one who brought me in the start, and he'd always say what he was doing. I'd tell him exactly what I had planned. Say, okay, as long as you mention this and this, so he got his input into it. It was basically never interfered, and pretty much with Eddie Jones, although you had to be a lot more detailed in what you were doing and how you were presenting it for Eddie, but they were good times. There was no flukes there. That was when Australian teams played like an Australian team. We had Australian coaches. Australian players. We didn't import players, from overseas so much. We probably had 2 overseas players in town, Strauss, and then we had Dan Vickerman, maybe a third with Heidi Rathbone. But in general terms, it was all Australian talent, and we played like Australians. And I think that's one thing that we've lost. Is our national identity with the Wallabies, and we tend to be just giving up and work like the Kiwis now.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. John, I suppose it was always going to be difficult to sort of maintain that sort of level of what you guys achieved, and in summary, obviously, sport goes in cycles, but like he says, it's from looking at things from sort of far afield, it seems to have changed. I mean, obviously, in terms of Eddie Jones, did you sort of, what do you sort of, his success that he experienced with the England team, is that something that you sort of thought, when he got the appointment, I suppose, it was a bit sort of, I wouldn't say it was controversial, but people sort of wondering what will he do, but he's sort of, proven anyone that was, any sort of critic is sort of proven wrong. But what were your thoughts, John, when you sort of got the appointment for England? Did you sort of think he'd go on and sort of, basically galvanise a team and it hit a little bit of turbulence here and there, but overall, it's been a phenomenal, appointment. Really, looking back at things.
I think that generally internationally that England was thought of as being the most pampered and spoilt team in the world. Wherever they went in the World Cup, there were lorries of brown mattresses they put into every room, so everybody had to sleep on the same mattress, and dietitians, and everybody's got a dietitian, but walking travelling with your dietitian and just other things. And I think that can't be good for player humility and sort of the way they go about their stuff. So when I heard Eddie was going there, I knew that he would make them accountable for everything that they did, and also question why do you deserve this, and you don't get things unless you
absolutely.
So and that's sometimes Australia went through a period like this, that the success of that 99 through 2000 or 97 through to 2003 team, a lot of young blokes who came in that got the benefits that they probably had been earned by other blokes, and they had performance to get the those special treatments.
Absolutely, that's the interesting point. I think we've certainly seen, something similar in the UK for the football team at times, and many years ago you had the golden generation of players, and it's you don't turn up and just win, John. You got to go out there and absolutely. I think that sort of humbleness and humility is sort of key, and it sort of strikes me, John, that sort of the generation when you sort of were Australia, just there was, like you said, the team had an identity in terms of that Australian identity, sort of to go out there and play. And do you think it's possible to sort of to get back there and sort of obviously they're competitive on the world stage and it's difficult to replicate that period, but do you sort of see the Australian national team being a force again soon, or?
Well, yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure because when you look at the head coaches of the provincial teams that we have here and the assistant coaches, like two new just been appointed at the Western Fourth, and they're both Kiwis. Surely in Australia we want to develop our own. What Australian rugby is doing with coaching in Australia is diabolical. There's no mentoring. Some of our best coaches are just going overseas rather than taking positions, but they're not getting offered positions. So it's very disturbing as a coach. I wouldn't like to be coming in now in Australia because I'm not a Kiwi, so I'd probably get a gig.
No, it's interesting, and I suppose it's I suppose there's a trend in a lot of sports, John, where if one team sort of experiences success, then you just find that around the world they employ coaches from that sort of country, whether it be in football, let's say a team wins a World Cup or rugby, but you'd have thought that the success that you guys experienced at that period would have they would have built on that, to be fair, looking at things from far afield. But I suppose it is what it is. And for yourself, John, I mean, what's your sort of vision moving forward? I mean, no doubt you sort of got your own goals and you've got your own career is going to keep going, but where do you sort of see yourself moving forward? You got the gig now at Newcastle. Where do you sort of see what's sort of your vision? More of the same, John, or where do you sort of see yourself going from here?
Look, if I could get into a mentor role with coaches, where I go up on Tuesday, Thursday night, Saturday, sit with them, watch them coach, and give them some advice. See if anybody wanted me to do that, I'd be interested in that. But as far as my coaching's concerned, I'm really winding down. 61 now, and we've got a holiday house in the area of Newcastle, the greater Newcastle area. So it's very timely for me that this opportunity came along. So I'm basically winding down, but that doesn't mean that wouldn't still like to help young coaches, and that's one thing that the Australian Rugby Union and New South Wales and all the different unions have got to do is they've got to give help to coaches, because just having a day where they can come and professional coaches coach, well, that's, as I said before, the art of coaching is coaching who's in front of you. And the coaching the New South Wales Waratahs compared to the coaching of, say, the under 16 on the North Shore is completely different. And it takes skill to identify that and tailor your coaching to the people who are standing in front of you.
Absolutely, that's a great point. That's a great and sort of just on that, John. One thing I want to sort of wrap up on, sort of you kind of have to join us and share your time. And if there's any sort of young coach listening, irrespective of what code they're in, rugby, rugby league, football, I'm sure they'll sort of gain. But is there sort of any sort of tips you can give anyone going into coaching? I think for me, the one way you coach what's in front of you, that's a great point. I think sometimes it's easy for ex-players who play at the very highest level to forget, if they're not coaching players, of their ability to make the most of what you got. And equally, some players may have not played at the highest level, and they've got players that are at that highest level. What would you say to any sort of coach going in the game? You've worked around the world, John. You've sort of been able to work with players and sort of cross-culturally and different abilities. What are some of the key things that you've learnt in your career for a young coach listening in, thinking, well, I could sort of do with a few ideas?
Well, the first thing I'd say is you've got to know your stuff. So, technique side of it is very important, and once golfing, teaching people how to golf, they all teach the same swing. You have to change to their swing. And tennis used to be the same until Chrissy Evert came along and had the two-handed bat, started ripping it past people, and then coaches sort of looked at that and said, well, that's a different way to do it. So that coaching what's in front of you, but you've got to know the technique yourself. You can't fake it. So when you're being a player who's continually throwing bad passes, you've got to be able to watch that and then be able to help him. First, identify what the problem is or what he's doing wrong. Two, either help him refine his technique, because some people use their wrists, some people use their fingers, some people do it all from the elbows, snapping pass out. What's best for him? So it's end focused. So if you can hit that spot with the right pass 10 times out of 10 or 9 times out of 10, just because it's slightly different or different the way I want to pass, or I want him to pass, I wouldn't play around with it. I'd play around with, help him with his technique, and that's that coaching what's in front of you. But it's also you being smart enough and knowing your stuff well enough to get it. Like I do a mountain of work on footwork for tackling because it's the one thing that I think, the approach, the tracking, and then the actual footwork to prepare for the tackle. One, it puts you in the best position possible, and two, it puts you in a position where you're not going to get hurt. Very important, particularly for kids when they're doing defence, is that it's success oriented and no theory of it, so they gain more and more competition. Look, I use formula, and my formula goes demonstration. Explanation. I explain what I want. Demonstrate, and I show them what I want. And then imitation. So I watch them do it, and the important thing is that they can't go back to how they always used to do it, because they're not learning anything. Even if it feels uncomfortable, you've got to do it the way that they were shown, the new way, so they really get the technique right, and then it's just repetition, and just give them the opportunity to practice it in slightly different situations, so they have to be adaptable, like they have to be in it, and that's the way it works for me.
Yeah,
it's and you can progress things as you go. You don't. Like, there are some things that are really, really simple, and I always say that I look more like Frankenstein than Einstein. So, what I teach them is not particularly earth blowing, but don't feel that it might be too simple, because the basis of skill is always a simple form.
Absolutely, that's a great point, John. I sort of, I've taken some points down for myself there as well in terms of coach. I'm sure the coaches, listening, have sort of, got a lot out of that, and I suppose any young players or players of any age really sort of, the realization that you've got to get out there and practice, but practice the right things is sort of key as well. But I really want to thank you, John, for coming on board the show. It's been fascinating speaking to you. I'm sure the listeners have sort of, really enjoyed the interview. So, we wish you all the best at Newcastle, and in your career, and moving forward with what you're doing now, and hopefully, I suppose from a mentoring perspective, hopefully people sort of listening in, realise that obviously, people like yourself have got a lot to give to the game. So certainly, coaches, listening to the show, can sort of learn a lot from people like yourself who've sort of been there and done that. So thanks again, John, for being on the show. That was John Muggleton on Salford City Radio, the Friday Sports Show. Your host, Jimmy Petruzzi, who's assistant coach at Newcastle Wildfire, but who's had a career around the world and been involved in some of the most successful, the most, if not the most successful period in Australian rugby as well, and has been kind enough to share his thoughts and insights. Thanks again, John. Great stuff.
It's my pleasure, Jim.
Thank you.